12-year-old Elise lived on Market Level 4 of Orion Spire, a massive cylindrical space station orbiting the gas giant Virella. The station was a marvel of engineering. Its outer hull shimmered with hexagonal solar panels that shifted like fish scales and spindly antenna arrays that reached toward distant stars, while inside, it buzzed with life from every corner of the galaxy. Market Level 4 was the station's beating heart. The atrium stretched 5 stories high, its ceiling a geodesic dome of reinforced glass panels that offered a breathtaking view of Virella's amber and turquoise clouds swirling in hypnotic patterns. Holographic neon signs in dozens of languages, from blocky Terran script to the flowing glyphs of the Andromeda colonies, blinked and scrolled above vendor stalls constructed from salvaged ship parts. The air was thick with competing aromas, sizzling purple starfish on smoking grills, the electric tang of ozone from hovercarts weaving between shoppers, and the honey-sweet floral scent of imported pollen that drifted from hanging garden pods. Elise and her mother, Michelle, lived in a compact apartment tucked into the upper ring of the atrium. A hexagonal pod, barely 30 square meters, its walls curved to follow the station's cylindrical shape. Their panoramic window overlooked the swirling chaos below. Copper-skinned merchants with 4 arms shouting over the din, chrome-plated robotic pets with LED eyes zipping between legs, and holographic ads for off-world vacations flickering against the oxidized metal walls. Inside their home radiated a surprising warmth. Michelle's bioluminescent plant samples from Virella's moons glowed amber and cerulean in pressurized hydro jars, while Blip's cylindrical tank bubbled beside Elise's fold-down bed. Michelle worked on Level 6, in the hydroponics lab, a sterile, humid chamber saturated with the perpetual thrum of pumps and the hush of mist, drifting between rows of floating planters suspended by magnetic rails. On some days, the plants, moon lettuce, firecress, the broad leaves of oxygen-hungry kelp imported from Old Terra's vanished seas, seemed to outnumber the people. Michelle, with her palms stained pale green and her hair forever rimmed with condensation, often came home carrying the phantom scent of alien mint and moss, tendrils of aroma trailing behind her long after she'd changed out of her work coveralls. Her hands, Elise noticed, were always in motion, unbraiding her hair with quick shakes, plucking at invisible threads on her uniform, or smoothing invisible wrinkles from the surface of their kitchen counter. Michelle's warnings were woven into every gesture and routine. No shortcuts, no deals, and never ask help from your Uncle Felix. Sometimes she would pause at the threshold of Elise's bedroom, shadowed in the doorway, eyes distant as if passing some memory or calculation before adding, "We're almost there, kid. Just keep your head down." Most afternoons after school, she'd take the long way home through the upper rings, following the perimeter walkway past the glassy observation deck, the engineering shops, and the Ganymede ice cream kiosk tended by a silent, many-eyed android. From above, the market's glow had always seemed inviting. Tiered rings of stalls, their canopies a patchwork of bright synthetics and battered canvas, the soft golden wash of lamplight diffused by the ever-present haze of cooking smoke and microclimate fog. She liked the way the market changed after the dinner rush. As the synthetic evening descended, the crowds thinned, their voices echoing off the arched glass until the drone of commerce became a kind of music. But at this hour, beneath the dome, everything was tinted a moody amber. The holographic signage flickered inconsistently, as though the power grids couldn't make up their minds, and the shadows pooled in the cul-de-sacs of the market's outer ring like ink spilled along the floor. In these hours, Orion Spire could almost feel peaceful. One night, though, as she made her way home, Elise noticed something strange. The market's lower tier, usually alive with the flashy improvisation of street performers and the haggling of off-world traders, hummed with a different, tenser energy. The lighting along the promenade had been dimmed, maintenance maybe, or another rolling power save. Shadows pooled in the alcoves and the corners between vendor stalls. Elise passed the usual suspects. The old Andromedan woman crooning to her clutch of singing crystals, the Terran triplets hawking arrays of genetically tuned insects wired into jewelry, the pale merchant who cultivated carnivorous mosses under blacklight domes. At the edge of the market, near the ventilation shafts where cool air spilled through the grates, the pet stalls glowed with the faint aquatic light of bioluminescent exotics. She paused at the hydroponics booth. Most evenings, it was a riot of greenery. Michelle's handiwork on full display, shoots and blossoms tumbling from vertical racks in dizzying technicolor. But tonight, the stall was deserted. No shimmer of irrigation mist, no humming of nutrient pumps, just a cold, empty shell and the faintly metallic taste of unease. Then the silence shattered. A sharp, high cry, human and raw. All at once the crowd surged, bodies pressing in and then recoiling, a stampede in miniature. Elise spun, searching for the source, and caught a blur at the far end of the aisle. 3 figures in long, iridescent cloaks, their faces lost behind reflective visors, converging on a woman with copper-bright hair. The figures moved with uncanny speed and coordination, arms locking around the woman's torso and shoulders. The woman bucked wildly, kicking at the air, but the figures dragged her off balance and toward the edge of the promenade. It took only a second for Elise to recognize the hair, then the voice. Her mother, Michelle. Another cry, this time choked off mid-breath, and the trio hustled her toward the maintenance corridor that cut along the spire's inner hull. Elise tried to scream. Her mouth opened, but the air caught in her throat, and her own voice sounded thin and childish. "Mom," she managed, but it was drowned by the din, by the sudden, fractal panic around her. No one intervened. The market's denizens scattered in all directions, some ducking behind vendor carts, most simply averting their eyes. Elise could feel the wrongness now as a physical force, see it reflected in the faces around her. Not just fear, but complicity, like the whole station had rehearsed this moment and agreed to look away. The cloaked figures, Elise couldn't tell if they were men, women, or even entirely human, hauled Michelle through a hatch barely wide enough for 2 people side by side. The door iris shut, and Elise, heart hammering, sprinted after them. Her feet slapped the polycrete. She nearly skidded into a cluster of overturned crates, recovering just in time to wedge herself between 2 frozen vendors. This close to the core, the air was icy and smelled sharply of ozone. The corridor was a harsh metallic V, lined with exposed pipes and pitted with warning stencils in at least 6 languages. Emergency glow strips ran blue along the floor, but half of them flickered out as Elise passed, plunging her in and out of darkness. She chased the echo of footsteps, the staccato percussion of boots, and the rustling whisper of the iridescent cloaks as they rounded a bend. Her lungs burned. She thought she heard her mother's voice, a desperate, fractured call, but it might have been her own memory, looping back on itself. The chase felt endless, but she was losing ground. The corridor forked, then forked again, branching into a mess of service tunnels and maintenance ladders. At one intersection, she caught a flash of colour. A copper strand of hair snagged on a jagged panel, and followed it, hands tearing at the catch as she barreled forward. The next tunnel was lined with grated floors and low-hanging junction boxes that scraped her shoulders. The temperature dropped further. Tiny spikes of frost crackled around the edges of the access panels. Finally, she rounded a blind corner and collided with something solid. She recoiled, blinking, and found herself face-to-face with a security drone, its chassis painted hazard yellow and bristling with an array of sensors. It hovered in place, a silent judge, its camera lenses focusing and zooming in on her face. Elise tried to sidestep, but the drone matched her movement, blocking her way with a mechanical arm tipped by a warning strobe. Behind the drone, the corridor ended in a heavy security hatch locked and unresponsive. Frantic, she pounded on the metal with her fists. "Let me through!" she yelled. On the other side, there was nothing but silence. No answering shouts, no trace of her mother or the figures who had taken her. The drone let her vent her panic for exactly 30 seconds, then emitted a low, polite tone and extended another arm. This one patted gently as if for comfort. It guided her, irresistibly but not unkindly, back down the corridor, away from the sealed hatch and the vanishing point of her mother's cries. She stumbled, nearly falling, and let the drone shepherd her all the way to the nearest cross-tunnel. There it released her and hovered in place, watching, its status light pulsing somewhere between yellow and red. Elise pressed her back to the cold metal wall. She tried to catch her breath, but all she could do was stare at the hatch, willing it to open, hating the indifferent machinery that separated her from her mother. She realized with a jolt that she'd left her comm tab, her only real link to the outside world, back in her apartment. Useless. She felt smaller than she ever had, like a single cell lost in the body of the spire, spinning through vacuum with nowhere to go and no one to help her. Except, not quite. She remembered the words, the warning woven into every bedtime ritual and breakfast scold. Never ask help from your Uncle Felix. She'd never met him, not really, just broken fragments of his legend pieced together from overheard arguments and the stories her mother swore she'd never tell. But she knew, in the hard pit of her stomach, that he was here, somewhere in the station, a shadow in the spire's veins. She pushed off the wall and started walking, letting her feet retrace the route back to the market's edge. The drone trailed her for a while, then peeled off, satisfied she was no longer a threat. Elise kept her head down and moved quickly, ignoring the stares from the vendors who pretended not to have seen anything at all. Elise ducked into a maintenance alcove tucked behind a vending machine that sold oxygen-infused beverages. The alcove was cramped, lit by a single flickering bulb, and smelled faintly of coolant and burnt circuits. She activated a private comm terminal embedded in the wall, one of Felix's old hideouts. The screen buzzed to life, revealing Felix's grinning face. Behind him, the cluttered interior of his ship was visible, walls lined with mismatched panels, dangling wires, and shelves overflowing with gadgets and stolen tech. Well, well, if it isn't my favorite niece, what kind of mess are we in? Elise explained everything. Felix's grin faded. He leaned forward, eyes sharp. I'm coming, he said. Stay put. Felix made his entrance like a man with a private audience, boots polished to a mirror shine, sharp blue lenses reflecting the gloom, and a coat so ostentatiously long it trailed the polycrete behind him, sweeping up market dust and the attention of every street rat between the noodle stalls and the betting kiosks. He found Elise exactly where he expected, in the shadowed margin of a maintenance corridor, trying to look invisible behind the grimy glow of a defunct vendor kiosk. He didn't so much greet her as absorb her, one arm thrown casually over her shoulder, the other already gesturing down the alley. "Don't look up," he whispered, as if the ceiling itself were bugged. "Don't look at anything that blinks." Then, with the brisk efficiency of a habit forged by survival, Felix led her into the market's true circulatory system. The alleys behind the alleys where the scent of fried yeast gave way to battery acid, and the ground was sticky with the residue of 1,000 unlicensed chemicals. Their route was jagged, looping through side corridors and over ductwork walkways that trembled under their weight. Elise kept pace, adrenaline muting the exhaustion in her legs, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. By human eyes, by drone optics, by the market itself, which seemed to inhale and exhale with their every step. They passed through a gauntlet of info dealers, the old women with their heads hardwired for neural relay, lips moving in ancient dialects as they bartered secrets for crypto and blood. Felix ignored them with studied indifference, but Elise sensed the flicker of recognition in their milky eyes. At one stall, a man with a face like a roadmap of surgical scars offered Felix a handful of silvery data slivers. Felix took them, palmed one, and tossed the rest into a waste chute with a dismissive snort. "What's that?" Elise whispered. "Keycard ghost. Might get us into admin if we're lucky." The next stop was a bar, which was less a bar and more a pressure cooker for the station's lowest common denominators. The Comet sign was a looping animated comet tail in screaming orange. The entrance was a curtain of frayed magnetic beads that threatened to zap anyone over 5 feet tall. Inside, the light was the colour of old blood, and the air was thick with a vapour that numbed the tongue. Felix moved without hesitation to the end of the counter, where the bartender sported a pair of mechanical insectoid eyes and a mouth that never quite closed. Felix ordered 2 shots of house, which tasted like the intersection of bleach and pepper spray. He set the second glass in front of Elise and leaned close, whispering a code phrase Elise half recognized from a bedtime story. The bartender didn't react, but a moment later he slid a napkin across the counter, its surface crawling with projected glyphs. Felix scanned it with his comtab, then lit the napkin on fire, the flames instantly devouring it and everything it contained. Elise stared at the empty countertop, her mind spinning. Was that... "Docking schedules," Felix said, already on his feet, "and something else. Look." He held up the comtab, showing her a map of the station's underbelly, with 3 locations pulsing in urgent red. They exited out the back, following the path the napkin had illuminated. The market was starting to wake up by now, the denizens bolder, the movement of goods and bodies swelling toward a crescendo. It made moving unnoticed both easier and harder. Easier because no one cared about 2 more faces in the throng, harder because the density of eyes and ears grew with every step. Felix plunged them into a hangar access corridor where the shadows were thick and the air was glacially cold, and where every 20 meters a surveillance node blinked in and out of existence, its attention span like a goldfish on amphetamines. He didn't bother with subtlety. At the first node, Felix popped a panel and jammed in a sub-miniature signal spike. Elise saw the blue spark, felt the momentary pulse of her skin and teeth as the system glitched, the cameras cycling through a 5-second loop. At the second, he palmed a tiny pellet of plastic explosive and crumbled it into the slot where the wires bunched together like muscle fibers. They hit the third node just as 2 maintenance bots rounded the corner, their faces blank except for the red LED strip that tracked the progress of their internal clock. Felix flashed a stolen maintenance badge, and for a split second, nothing happened. Then the bots chirped and rolled past, their sensors apparently satisfied. But the near miss made Elise's brain seize up. What if the badge failed? What if the bots reported? What if they were already caught and just didn't know it yet? She nearly ran into Felix, who had stopped just before the final bulkhead where the corridor opened into the cavernous volume of Docking Bay 17. Beyond the transparent polymer wall, Elise could see the silhouettes of ships, sleek, predatory, black as polished stone, their hulls painted with the angular script of the Thokarans. The air here shimmered with heat and electromagnetic noise. Elise noticed her hair lifting off her scalp as if the static charge alone could levitate her. Felix pulled her back into an alcove, his voice so low it was almost a vibration in her bones. "Don't look at them," he said, "and don't let them see you looking." Elise nodded, making herself small. She peered through the slats in the wall, heart thudding, and saw the figures unloading cargo pods from the largest ship. The Thokarans moved with a chilling, effortless precision. No wasted motion, no hurry, just the grim certainty of a species that had long ago stopped believing in luck. Their faces were hidden behind mirrored visors, their hands covered with segmented gloves, but their posture was unmistakable. Predators at work. One pod smaller than the others was being rolled toward a service door by a pair of Thokarans and a human dockhand. Elise squinted, willing herself to see through the pod's opaque shell. As if in response to her concentration, a faint metallic clang echoed down the corridor, and for a split second, the human inside the pod slammed open a viewing panel. Copper-bright hair flared in the harsh light. Elise's mother. Michelle's eyes locked onto the world outside, wild and desperate, but then a Thokaran slapped the panel shut and palmed the seam with a glowing tool. The pod jerked, rolled forward and disappeared into the bowels of the station. Felix let the moment stretch, then exhaled in a long, slow hiss. "They're not killing her," he said. "They're trading her." Elise wanted to scream. Instead, she gritted her teeth and pressed her forehead to the wall, willing herself to stay upright. Can we get her back?" Felix shrugged, but there was nothing careless about it. "Depends what she's worth." They waited in the alcove until the last Thokaran vanished into the docking bay's maze of hallways. Felix hurried Elise back the way they came, retracing their steps through the frozen arteries of the spire. The return trip was faster, but every corner felt electrified, every sound amplified. At one intersection, they almost collided with a pair of security drones. Felix ducked into a janitor's closet and held Elise close, both of them pressed against a wall lined with ancient mops and storage bins. The drones floated by oblivious, and Elise felt the adrenaline spike leave her hollow and shaking. When they reached the relative safety of the main market, Felix stopped at a vending kiosk and bought 2 cans of hypercaffeinated soda. He handed one to Elise, then cracked his open and drank half in a gulp. "They'll keep her alive for at least a day," he said. "Maybe 2. "You know why the Thokarans do this?" Elise shook her head. Felix smiled, but it was the kind of smile that meant nothing good. "They like leverage. They collect people as bargaining chips, hostages, but not for ransom, for favors, for tech, for information. Your mum's a scientist, right? Bet they think she has something worth all this effort. Anything biotech is valuable to them." Elise's mind reeled. "But mum's a botanist. She doesn't do any cutting-edge research, just hydroponic monitoring. So what do we do?" Felix paused for a second, then turned to Elise with a devious smile spreading across his face. "Then we give them her real super-secret research that they can't resist." They cut through several layers of the spire, passing through a maze of residential corridors and abandoned classrooms until they reached Michelle's hydroponics lab. The place looked even smaller than she remembered, crowded with the detritus of Michelle's latest experiments. Racks of half-grown plants, beakers clouded with algae, and the omnipresent hum of hydroponic pumps. Felix swept the clutter onto the floor, commandeered the central table, and began to assemble a toolkit from the odds and ends littering the shelves. "Grab that bug of yours," he said. "The one with the legs, and anything else that looks unnatural." Elise protested. "It's not a bug, it's my pet tadpole, Blip." "Whatever. Blip is perfect for what we need." Felix started grabbing random pieces of lab equipment and putting them into a box. Elise grabbed Blip's tank and they left to create their ruse. Back at their apartment, Felix and Elise transformed their living room into a makeshift laboratory that hummed with desperate ingenuity. Michelle's hydroponic experiments, luminescent ferns and phosphorescent moss in hermetically sealed jars, lined the walls like bioluminescent sentinels, bathing the room in an eerie cocktail of emerald and amber light that danced across their determined faces. The floor disappeared beneath a chaotic sprawl of tools. Soldering irons with tips blackened from overuse, tangled coils of copper wire that snaked between their feet, and jagged fragments of salvaged circuit boards that glinted like technological confetti. With surgical precision, they secured Blip's cylindrical habitat to a dented aluminum desk lamp they'd rescued from a station recycling chute, its once white surface now mottled with rust stains and scorch marks. Felix's fingers, nimble despite their size, attached a salvaged buzz generator to the base, its intermittent hum punctuating the silence as he meticulously painted inscrutable alien glyphs across the tank's curved surface with iridescent ink. Meanwhile, Elise measured precise drops of bioluminescent algae concentrate into the water, transforming Blip's home into a swirling nebula of toxic-looking chartreuse that pulsed with an unnatural, hypnotic rhythm. Through it all, Blip himself drifted in blissful ignorance, his translucent body suspended in the center of this cosmic charade, vestigial limbs twitching sporadically like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. "The Thokarins worship biotechnology like a religion," Felix explained, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "We'll convince them this contraption forces accelerated evolution in primitive organisms. Those embryonic legs of his will sell our story better than any words could." The room filled with the hum of circuits and the occasional spark. Elise named it the Genesis lamp. Felix paced the length of the apartment with barely contained energy, comm-tab in hand, while Elise waited rigidly on the edge of her mother's battered couch. Their living room had been overtaken by the throbbing, hissing artifact they'd constructed, every surface shimmering with the reflected light of the Genesis lamp. The only thing moving faster than Blip's cilia was the blur of Felix's thoughts. He rechecked the device's readout, then the message draft he'd queued up for the Thokarins, then the time. There was still time. They rehearsed the pitch. Elise bit her lip until she tasted copper, and tried not to imagine what the Thokarins might be doing to her mother. When Felix finally spoke, it was in a crisp, rehearsed cadence. "You ready?" Elise nodded, clutching Blip's tank like a talisman. They loaded the tank and its lamp into a foam-lined case, along with a twisted bundle of cables, vials of algae, and a set of tools that looked more like dental instruments than anything scientific. Felix straightened his collar, rolled his shoulders, and nodded at Elise to start recording. The comm-tab's lens flickered once. On, then off, then on again, blinking like an anxious eye. Felix began. "This is Felix Marrow, representing the interests of Michelle Corrigan. You have stated your terms for the exchange." He gestured as if welcoming an invisible observer into the sanctum of their apartment. "We present our counteroffer. Behold the Genesis lamp." His hands swept over the lamp, fingers splayed for dramatic effect, then lingered on Blip, who obligingly waggled a vestigial leg in the bioluminescent soup. "We've isolated a process for forced somatic adaptation. In layman's terms, forced evolution. Observe." He leaned into the lens, eyes wide with the practiced awe of a street magician. "The subject begins as a larval organism. With a lamp-specific biophotonic field, limb development accelerates exponentially. Witness the emergence of proto-appendages, the neural rewiring." He let the camera linger on Blip, whose limbs twitched in grotesque punctuation, then swept a handful of algae concentrate into the tank. The glowing solution fizzed, giving the whole display a mad scientist edge. Felix finished with a flourish. If you wish to complete the transaction, respond within the hour. Attempt to double-cross us, and the technology will be transferred to a rival interest. He terminated the recording and slumped onto the kitchen chair. Elise exhaled, shoulders sagging. Do you think they'll believe it? They'll have to, Felix said, firing off the video to a contact string he'd torn from the napkin in the bar. He double-encrypted it, routed it through a dozen proxies, and added a deadman switch just in case. Now there was nothing to do but wait. The minutes crawled by, interrupted only by the faint, arrhythmic churr of Blip's tank and the background drone of the spire's ventilation. Felix, never one for idleness, began pacing again, counting steps, muttering calculations, tweaking parameters on the lamp. Elise watched him in silence, her mind looping through every memory she had of Michelle. The careful hands tending seedlings, the laugh that rattled like loose change, the way she always hummed old Earth songs during blackouts. She wondered if her mother was humming now, in the darkness of a Thokarin cell. 25 minutes later, the comm tab pinged. Felix froze mid-step, then pounced, reading the message twice before handing it to Elise. They want the exchange, docking bay 17. They claim they'll return Michelle on site. Elise's throat tightened. Do you trust them? He shook his head. Not even a little. They packed the Genesis lamp and Blip into the foam case and made their way out, Felix in the lead, Elise trailing close behind. The outer corridors of the spire were busier now, the pedestrian traffic thickening as the station cycled toward its artificial dusk. They reached the elevator banks and hit the button for level 8. The elevator itself was a relic from the station's founding, a chromium-lined capsule that vibrated with every stop, its walls etched with the graffiti of 100 prior passengers. Felix kept his gaze fixed on the digital floor display, but Elise watched the other occupants, a pair of silent freight haulers, a woman in a business suit with a laser-cut bob and a face carved from marble. Everyone was so self-contained, so sealed off against the ambient weirdness of station life. Elise wondered if that's what it took to survive here. Level 8 was quieter, almost reverent. They navigated a maze of soft-walled cubicles and hydroponic test bays until they reached the comm booth, its curved glass wall framing the endless void outside. Felix slipped inside and locked the door. Elise stayed just outside, peering in through the glass, her breath fogging the surface. He set up the lamp and the tank with theatrical care, arranging the props for maximum impact. He checked the lighting, adjusted the angle, and gave Blip a gentle nudge, coaxing him to perform for the camera. Then he cued the video call and waited. It took less than 30 seconds for the Thokarins to answer. The screen filled with the mirrored mask of their negotiator, the surface shifting with impossible colours. The voice that emerged was a multi-tonal chorus, a language that didn't quite fit human ears. Felix played the video again, this time live, narrating as he went. He showed close-ups of Blip's developing limbs, the readings from the lamp, the strange runes he'd scrawled onto the tank. He referenced Michelle's work, hinted at other prototypes, and made a point of flipping the tank upside down at one point, proving its resilience under stress. He ended with a succinct offer. Exchange at docking bay 17, 2 hours. Delivery only upon return of Dr. Corrigan. The Thokarin negotiator didn't reply immediately, but the shifting colours on its mask intensified. Then, with abrupt finality, it spoke. Agreed. Arrive at 2100. Bring the device. The woman will be returned as agreed. The call cut out. Felix powered down the lamp, packed everything back into the case, and gave Elise a look that was equal parts triumph and terror. They bought it, he said quietly. We're on. The next 2 hours passed in a fever dream of preparation. Felix triple-checked the lamp's power core, swapped out the algae for an extra-potent batch, and tattooed fresh glyphs onto the surface of Blip's tank in the hope of making the effect more alien. Elise tried to write a message for her mother, in case things went wrong, but after 3 drafts gave up and settled for I love you. Hang on. They made their way to the industrial sector of Orion Spire well ahead of the meeting time. The transition from the residential decks to the underbelly of the station was abrupt. Gone were the soft lights and peaceful hum of living quarters, replaced by the stark glare of sodium bulbs and the relentless mechanical din of power relays. The air smelled of hot metal and ozone, and the corridors grew wider, more impersonal, as if designed for non-human passage. Felix led the way through a maze of bulkheads and empty loading docks, steering clear of the heavy security presence near the main access points. He seemed to know exactly where to go, ducking down side corridors and climbing narrow ladders with the confidence of someone who'd memorized the station's architectural DNA. Elise followed, hugging the case to her chest, her heart clanging in time with the distant thump of the generators. The final approach to Docking Bay 17 was a gauntlet of cargo lifts and maintenance hatches. Felix paused at a blind corner, scanned the area for surveillance, and then signaled Elise to follow. Just as they rounded the bend, a tall figure stepped from the shadows near a sealed hatch. He wore a silver coat that gleamed even in the sickly light, and his badge caught the glow like a flare. He was older than Felix by at least a decade, with the weathered look of someone who'd never quite adapted to station gravity, and he moved with the measured confidence of a predator in unfamiliar territory. "Felix Marrow, Elise, I'm Jack Connor, Interstellar Marshal." The Marshal's interrogation room was little more than a repurposed utility closet. Concrete walls lined with banks of dusty monitors, the ceiling webbed with jury-rigged cables and fiber lines. The smell of solder and burnt plastic permeated the air beneath the ozone tang of the station's ventilation. Jack Connor ushered them inside with a brisk, no-nonsense sweep of his arm, then sealed the hatch behind. Felix thought the door's hiss sounded too final, as if this was a place meant for confessions, not planning. In the center of the room, a holographic schematic of Orion's spire hovered above a battered metal table. The three-dimensional rendering pulsed with shifting nodes, security checkpoints, pressure doors, a lattice of access tunnels that glowed blue and red with urgent intensity. "Welcome to the war room," Jack said, tapping a finger on the edge of the projection. Instantly, the image zoomed in, a dizzying spiral that landed on Docking Bay 17. Next to it, a pair of avatars blinked into existence, labelled Felix and Elise in block capitals. "Sit," Jack ordered, and they did. Felix perching on a stool and Elise keeping her arms locked around the Genesis lamp's case. Blip's tank sat next to her on the table, its occupant pulsing with a nervous light. Jack wasted no time. Thokarans have been running these abductions for 6 months. 3 stations, always the same routine. They target someone irreplaceable. They demand a piece of hard science in return. Never the same buyer twice. Until now, he flicked a switch and one monitor filled with a freeze frame. Michelle Corrigan, bound and gagged, being roughly escorted by 2 thuggish Thokarans. The timestamp read less than an hour old. Felix's jaw tightened. "We're the only ones with a shot, aren't we?" Jack's expression was flinty. "You're the only ones who the Thorakans think has Dr. Jennings' new biotech device, meaning you are the only one they will let walk into that docking bay alive." Elise's voice was thin, but steady. "You want us to play along." He nodded. "They'll expect you to come to Docking Bay 17 at 2100 hours. They'll expect you to bring the lamp and the organism." He looked pointedly at Felix. "Your job is to look terrified and act compliant. When the time comes, you'll be the signal." He reached into his coat, produced a flat black case, and cracked it open. Inside was a button, glassy and red, hardwired to a slender detonator. "When you hand off the lamp, Elise hits this." He pushed the case across the table, and Elise took it with a trembling hand. Felix studied the detonator, then looked up at Jack. "You're planning to blow the whole bay?" "EMP. Non-lethal, but it'll fry any Thokaran hardware, including their neural restraints. Should give you a window to grab the scientist and run." Jack gestured at the schematics, tracing an escape route in violet light. "We'll handle external security. You need to get yourselves and your mother to this hatch here, Service Tunnel D. You will have around 60 seconds after the blast to make that tunnel and safety. After that, the Thorakans will start to recover." Elise nodded, her face rigid, eyes fixed on the flashing dot that represented the only viable exit. In her mind, the sequence played out in bullet points. Hand off the lamp, trigger the EMP, grab her mother, run. Simple in theory. "What about Blip?" Elise asked. "Your plan means he will die." Jack stood silent for a second, then said, "That is the sacrifice we need to make." Felix interjected, "Not really." He turned to Elise and winked. "I've got an idea on that." Docking Bay 17 was carved into the aftmost flank of Orion's spire, an industrial wound in the station's pristine skin. The access corridor was long and unlit, the kind of place where the architects had clearly assumed only robots or criminals would ever walk. Each step amplified the tension, shoes slapping against metal that reverberated the sounds straight into their bones. Felix, cradling the Genesis lamp, led with his chin up, eyes darting for movement. Elise tucked in behind. Each carried their own silent terror, but neither broke stride. They reached the threshold of the bay and paused. The air inside was different, colder, more humid, laced with the ionized tang of freshly charged machinery. The walls soared, lined with shipping crates and the ribbed hulls of dormant shuttlecraft. Massive overhead cranes, painted hazard yellow, hung in stasis like the arms of sleeping titans. Felix scanned the bay. Nothing at first, then, eyes adjusting, he picked out 3 Thokarins. Tall, scaleless, their armor a patchwork of scavenged badges of violence from a dozen local systems. They stood just below the shadow line of the catwalk, hands resting easily on their sidearms. Their faces were covered in ceremonial masks, mirrored and prismatic, catching stray light and refracting it into jagged rainbows across the cargo deck. The leader's mask was edged with a crown of cobalt spikes, like a parody of human royalty. Elise felt a pulse in her palm and glanced down. The detonator Jack had given her vibrated, the briefest haptic buzz. She looked up at Felix, and he nodded. The signal already rehearsed 100 times in the elevator ride down. She tried to slow her breathing, but her pulse only accelerated. The Thokarin leader stepped forward, its movement sinuous, almost mocking. It lifted one arm in what passed for a greeting, but the gesture was all blade and threat. "You are Marrow," it said, the translator rendering the words in a sibilant monotone. Felix nodded. "I brought what you wanted," he said, and hefted the Genesis lamp slightly as if to prove it. The lamp glowed through its containment glass, the blue-white radiance pulsing in time with the organism inside. "We want the woman." The leader hissed, and a pair of subordinates materialized from the shadows behind a stack of crates. Between them, they dragged Michelle Corrigan, her hair tangled, lab coat torn, eyes wide in disbelief and hope. Her hands were zip-tied at the wrists, her face streaked with the residue of whatever sedative they'd used to keep her compliant. When she saw Felix and Elise, she nearly lost her balance, only the grip of her captors keeping her upright. Elise took a trembling step forward, but Felix threw out an arm to keep her back. Elise's mouth went dry. She wanted to shout, to run, but she locked herself in place. Felix raised the lamp, careful to keep the containment field exposed. "Now the exchange," the leader said, "all business." Felix nodded and began to walk, slow and deliberate, closing the gap between himself and the Thokarins. Every step was a negotiation. He felt the eyes above the catwalks, the crawl of surveillance lasers painting his back. He walked to within 10 meters, then stopped. "Release her," Felix said. The leader hesitated, then gestured. The guards let go of Michelle, who staggered but did not run. For a moment, all was still. "Catch," Felix said, and with a sudden, practiced motion, he flung the Genesis lamp underhand towards the leader. The device described a perfect arc through the charged air. The Thokarins moved as one, lunging, bellowing in alarm, desperate to secure their prize before it shattered. In the moment that all 4 were clustered beneath the falling lamp, Elise squeezed the detonator. There was no warning, no telltale whine or flare, just a silent, blinding pulse of blue that seemed to flash from every surface at once. To human eyes, it was over in a fraction of a second, but for the Thokarins, the effect was catastrophic. Their masks crackled and shorted out. One dropped to its knees, clutching its skull. Another spun and fired wildly into the air. The leader stood rigid, every muscle locked in seizure. Even the overhead cranes hiccuped, their status lights blinking into dormancy. Felix didn't wait. He sprinted straight for Michelle, scooping her by the elbow and hauling her upright. "Move!" he yelled, and Elise was already at his side, ducking the wild, uncoordinated swings of the stunned Thokarins. The 3 of them made for the service tunnel, Felix counting each second, knowing the window was brutally narrow. Behind them, chaos reigned. The Thokarins howled and thrashed, their neural wetware completely scrambled. But other threats loomed. From the far side of the bay, more figures were mobilizing, some human, some not, all with weapons drawn and very little interest in who had started what. The EMP had bought time, but it hadn't erased the risk. The access hatch loomed ahead, a battered oval inset into the wall, already marked with the ultraviolet glyphs of emergency egress. Felix slapped the palm reader and fell through, dragging Michelle and Elise behind. The door slammed shut with the hiss of a vacuum seal. They barreled down a maintenance shaft, hands scraping on the greasy ladders, lungs burning with recycled air. Somewhere above, the sounds of pursuit echoed. Shouts, the clatter of boots, the metallic ring of someone pounding on the hatch. Felix pushed harder, half dragging Michelle, who stumbled but never let go of his hand. The tunnel ended in a junction box, a dead end to anyone who didn't know how to pop the security plate. Felix had already memorized the trick: a twist, a shove, and the whole panel slid aside, revealing a crawl space barely wide enough for human shoulders. He went through first, then Michelle, then Elise, who had to squirm the last meter with her knees tucked to her chest. They emerged into a dark, silent chamber lined with backup batteries and climate control panels. For a moment, it felt like being inside the heart of the station, a secret place where the rules of pursuit and capture no longer applied. Felix slumped against the wall, panting. Michelle reached for Elise, dragging her into a fierce embrace. "You shouldn't have come for me," she said, voice muffled by sobs. "You should have run." Felix shook his head, forcing a smile. "Not really our style, sis." They sat there, catching their breath until the comm panel embedded in the wall beeped. Felix approached, wary, but the display showed only a single incoming message. "Marshal Jack Connor, priority channel." Felix accepted the call. Jack's face appeared, backlit by flickering emergency strobes. "Status? We're clear," Felix said. "EMP worked as advertised. The package is secure." Jack nodded, the lines on his face deepening with relief. "Good. Stay put. Security's sweeping the upper decks, but it'll be a mess for hours. I'll find you when it's safe." The connection cut. Felix looked to Elise, then Michelle. "Now we wait," he said. Michelle looked at Felix with a slight smile and said, "The package. Is that what I am now?" They all burst out in a quiet, nervous laughter before settling in to wait while Jack and his team took care of the Thorikins. The next hour was an agony of silence, broken only by the periodic groan of the station's cooling systems. Michelle paced, every few minutes touching Elise's hair or face as if to confirm she was real. Felix dozed in snatches, the adrenaline crash leaving him nauseous and faintly resentful of his own body. At last, the outer hatch cycled with a hydraulic growl, and Jack Connor stepped through, pulse pistol drawn until he clocked their faces and let the barrel drop. He definitely looked worse for wear. Several scorch marks on his coat, a rent in one sleeve, and a rivulet of dried blood glistening from a fresh split bisecting his left eyebrow. His eyes swept the chamber, weighing the damage, then landed on Michelle. A quiet nod. "Time to go," he said, voice hoarse but somehow gentle. No one argued. Jack led the way, retracing the labyrinthine service routes by memory, Felix and the others hustling to keep pace. The tunnels behind them reverberated with distant alarms, automated voices shouting evacuation orders in a dozen languages, punctuated by the staccato clatter of boots. Sometimes Jack would pause, motion them into a side alcove, and let a security squadron thunder past before waving them onward. At these moments, Michelle would squeeze Elise's hands so tightly she thought her bones might compress, but Elise never flinched. She had never felt so alive, so utterly present, even with danger breathing down their necks. Jack shepherded them through a checkpoint, his badge overriding the glass-eyed stares of the auto-drones. They emerged into the main concourse and were immediately herded by harried emergency staff. At the triage center, a harried medic tried to separate Michelle and Elise for evaluation, but Michelle clung to her daughter with a force that brooked no contradiction. Felix grumbled at the alcohol swab stinging his wrist, and Jack turned to leave the room saying, "I forgot something. Be right back." He returned a few minutes later and walked over to Elise, one hand held behind his back and a grin spreading across his face. Someone was lonely. His hand moved, revealing a sealed plastic bag with Blip happily floating inside. "Our hero survived his assault on the Thorikins," Jack said, nodding to Felix. "Great idea, sealing the little guy in a bag," Felix shrugged. "Didn't want our victory to turn into a tragedy." Elise took the bag from Jack and then, surprising everyone, leaned forward and gave Jack a quick hug. "Thank you, Marshal Connor." The nurse brought an oversized beaker to Elise that she could use as Blip's temporary home. Elisa carefully emptied the contents of the bag in the vessel and then nestled in his tank against her ribs. Blip seemed completely unperturbed by the chaos. After the medics finished treating their injuries and cleared them, Jack steered the group into an unused office, shutting the door with finality. Michelle sagged into an office chair, her hair a ragged halo, face creased with exhaustion and a joy that bordered on delirium. Elise hovered nearby, hands trembling as she fed Blip a pellet from stash she had in a hidden pocket. Jack leaned on the edge of the desk. After a few seconds, he broke the silence. "Well, we have interrogated the Thorikins. I wish you could seen their faces when I revealed that they had blown their whole operation trying to obtain an old desk lamp taped to a kid's pet's tank." The whole room erupted in laughter, the fear and tension of their experiences over the past 24 hours starting to ease. Michelle reached for Elise, pulling her close, and for the first time in years, Elise allowed herself to lean in. Jack gave the rundown on what happened after they had sealed themselves in the service tunnel. The Thorikin resistance was much more concentrated and intense than Jack's team has expected. Once the action had concluded, they discovered why. The head of the entire organization and his Czech lieutenants were all in the docking bay, apparently planning the next phase of the takeover of this sector. This operation didn't just shut down their kidnapping and smuggling ring on this station. With these arrests, we have effectively ended the Thorikin criminal ring throughout the entire sector of space. Felix grinned. "Not bad for Tadpole." They laughed again. After a few more minutes of discussing the events of the day and aftermaths, the group left the office together, moving as a unit down the gold-lit corridors. Crowds of refugees, security teams, and persistent news drones flowed around them, each with their own version of the recent chaos. Elise felt the eyes of strangers on them, but for once it didn't matter. She walked tall, her mother's hand clasped in hers, Felix whistling a tune she vaguely recognized as an old Earth anthem. Jack dropped back, keeping a watchful distance, but she caught him smile whenever Blip surfaced in his jar, mouth opening and closing in a comic O. They reached the central atrium where the station's glass dome arched overhead, filtering starlight into columns that spanned the open plaza. Around them, market stalls reopened. Children shrieked and darted between vendor carts. A string quartet resumed their set as if the preceding hours had been nothing more than a rehearsal glitch. Life insistent and undiminished. At the far end of the promenade, in the shadow of the Orion Spire's legendary blue beacon, Jack stopped, turned, and reached for the jar with Blip. He held it up to the light, watched the tadpole swim with a slow, deliberate grace, and then handed the jar to Elise with an uncharacteristic solemnity. "Take care of the little guy," he said. Elise nodded and pressed the cool glass to her cheek. After saying their final thank yous and goodbye, the family left to make the long trek back to their apartment. Jack lingered at the edge of the plaza, scanning the upper galleries for prying eyes. When he caught Elise's gaze, he gave a single approving nod and quick wave before turning to return to his office. As they walked the glowing stalls and the drifting music approaching their residential area, Elise clutched Blip's tank. The tadpole blinked, his legs twitching. Felix leaned down. "You know, kid, I think Blip's got a future in espionage." Elise laughed. "Actually, I think he's due for retirement." And so, in the glittering heart of Orion Spire, a girl, her mother, her rogue uncle, and a tiny tadpole walked into the future, together.
Look how active it is today. Isn't that fascinating?